I like to say content moderation decisions are like assholes. Everybody's got one. I was shocked by the fact that there wasn't any porn in the App Store, because as everybody knows, the internet is for porn, but then the App Store wasn't.
Welcome to revolution.social, a podcast where we are looking at the history and future and structure of social media, about what we can do to make it a better place. And I am excited today to have sat down with Yoel Roth, the former head of trust and safety at Twitter, currently head of trust and safety at the Match Group, and someone who has an actual doctorate in internet governance and trust and safety himself.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
So yes, Yoel, what an amazingly interesting and educated and so deep on the topic of governance, trust and safety. I mean, these are all issues. We all think it would be an easy job, right? Because we would just do what we believe in. But it seems to me that it's one of the harder jobs that you could possibly have at a platform like Twitter or any public platform, where you have to take into account 360 degrees of opinion and bias, and this is what I would do. So how was it talking to Yoel?
Yoel is someone who has deeply researched these issues and understands how they're put into practice, both as an academic, getting his PhD in internet governance, trust and safety issues before that was even a field of study, and then through 8 years working on the Twitter trust and safety team, and now working at it on Match. In the gap between working on Twitter and Match, he sat down and said, okay, so if we're going to adopt social media protocols, if we're going to adopt Blue Sky and Mastodon and Nostr, how do we make these spaces safe? How do we help these communities of people running these protocols govern themselves? And that's really critical to what I was getting at with the Social Media Bill of Rights, is that we have the right to self-governance. We have the right to set our own rules. But it doesn't mean that there aren't rules. It doesn't mean that we don't develop an enforcement process. And so what Yoel did in his paper with Sam Lai is the two of them analyzed the problems that exist in large social media platforms and then looked at how they could be solved in a protocol era. So we've gone from centralized platforms of social media where a single person, a Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Evan Spiegel, they get to decide who can say what and what the rules are, to a world where each of us, each community, each server, each moderation team gets to decide what is appropriate, but it doesn't alleviate the kind of attacks and problems. And so what Yoel goes into is like, okay, what is the reality of solving these complicated social problems of how do we govern ourselves? We're just so lucky to have someone who understands what it's like to run the centralized system, and then study what we need to do to run an open system that includes all of us.
And I think this is such a key part of the Bill of Rights that you're advocating for the creation of. And so it was a really, really fascinating conversation. So I think we should jump in and take a listen.
I'm so excited to have you on, Yoel. I'm excited to hear your story. I've followed you for a long time. I'd love to know a bit about yourself and how you got involved in trust and safety, and how you became the doctor of trust and safety.
So 15 odd years ago, I was working on a PhD in the field of communication, which a lot of people think means I have a PhD in PR, but actually communication is a field that looks at ultimately persuasion, information, and how humans and societies and media intersect with each other to form understanding. And for me, the question I got really interested in was, how do we make governance decisions about the internet in a legitimate way? Because I remember in sort of the very early days of having an iPhone, I was shocked by the fact that there wasn't any porn in the App Store, because as everybody knows, the internet is for porn, but then the App Store wasn't. And we started to see in conversations with Steve Jobs and the team at Apple that actually it boiled down to a very simple preference, which was that Steve Jobs didn't like porn, and therefore there wasn't porn in the App Store. And that kind of foundationally seemed like an illegitimate way to make decisions about this massively consequential piece of technology, which was the smartphone. And for me, that raised a question not so much about porn itself, but about who gets to make decisions about how the internet and technology work, and what are ways to make those governance choices more legitimate, more fair, and more protective of user rights. And so I was studying those questions in the context of gay dating apps, where I spoke with some of the developers building the earliest generation of dating apps and found that the way they were making decisions didn't feel very legitimate either. One of them talked about how interpreting App Store policies was a Talmudic exercise. Others were talking about how they just sort of made decisions as they went about what was allowed and what wasn't. And as I was finishing up my research, I decided that the best way to try to shape this system for the better was maybe to get my hands dirty and do it from within. And so I spent about 8 years at Twitter in the trust and safety team, helping to build out the company's policies, helping to enforce them, and then ultimately leading the organization of folks who are working on trying to make Twitter a safer and more respectful place.
Yeah, it's funny. When I obviously left many years before you joined, but when I was there, all the trust and safety things were just decided by Crystal, who was also running the front desk and in charge of, any support emails or everything else. It was just like, oh, this is a thing that we wished didn't exist and we wished we didn't have to pay any attention to. And maybe someone will go off and handle it.
If you talk to anybody who runs a social site, that's pretty much the journey of trust and safety. It's the problem comes up, and it could be that somebody posts something awful on your platform. It could be somebody shows up at your office irate that you deleted their account. Something happens. And then everybody kind of looks around the room and waits for somebody else to raise their hand. And there's always one sucker, and that sucker raises their hands and they're like, fine, I'll deal with this. And now you have a head of trust and safety. And that arc is universal on every platform. Twitter went through it. Before that, LiveJournal went through that. Before that, MySpace went through. Like, everybody has been through a version of this. And if you talk to the folks who work in trust and safety, the unifying ethos is we encounter some problem or some pain that somebody on the internet is having, and we say, yeah, that's my responsibility now.
Yeah, and then you get to make what everyone else to the outside seems like obviously easy decisions, but on the inside are exceedingly complicated.
Totally. I mean, something that's both nice and also complicated about trust and safety is that everybody has an opinion about it. I like to say content moderation decisions are like assholes. Everybody's got one. And the sort of tricky thing about that is that if you make a decision and somebody's gut reaction to it is, no, that's wrong, what makes your decision more legitimate than theirs? What makes my opinion about the App Store more legitimate than Steve Jobs's? And that tension never goes away. The opportunity within that, I think, is to make these decisions as inclusive as possible. I think a lot of times trust and safety gets characterized as this kind of ivory tower procedure. A bunch of people who go off in a room by themselves, make decisions. There's no accountability. There's no transparency to it. It's a dictatorship. And the benefit of everybody having an opinion is that if you listen, actually you can make those decisions in a much more legitimate and inclusive way.
Yeah, I remember going in, I think it was 2017, sitting down with Jack Dorsey going like, catching up, and he's like, should I ban Trump? And, my answer at the time was it's too late. He's now been elected president. All of the investors want Twitter in the news every single day. You're going to get fired if you do this. But these decisions about the rules and behaviors, one of the tricky parts that I know you've written about is when you make it transparent and when you make it visible and entirely accessible, the people who are the bad actors will learn how to manipulate the system most effectively.
It's one of the foundational tensions of trust and safety. Like throughout my career, I've been a proponent of being as transparent as a company conceivably can be about the decisions you're making and why you're making them. You brought up the decision to ban Trump. That was one of the most consequential choices that Twitter's trust and safety team made. And one of the moments where actually I think we did the right thing in a situation where there was no right answer was publishing in full the internal rationale for the decision that we made to ban the sitting president of the United States from the platform. And almost immediately, people read the rationale and disagreed with it.
Of course.
Angela Merkel disagreed with the decision. People condemned, even people who didn't like the president, condemned Twitter's decision as this immense overreach of power. And I think there's merit to that. I think it was an unavoidable choice. But the important thing for me is that we put the rationale out there. And a lot of times companies don't. And one of the reasons for that is trying to avoid giving bad actors a playbook to understand exactly how you kind of split hairs as you're enforcing policies. And we've seen that some of the most prolific bad actors on the internet, whether they're troll farms interfering in elections or people engaged in serial harassment, have a deep understanding of platform policies. I don't think that's a reason not to be transparent, but it is a reason to be thoughtful about how you do it, when you do it, and what some of the consequences of being transparent could be.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you were talking about was the complexity of a single entity, a single CEO, a single organization having all of this power over space. And that is what caused Mike Masnick to talk about the protocols, not platforms, the idea that it's an algorithmic approach to free speech, that we use technology, we build things that work like the web, like email, as opposed to centralized apps. After you left Twitter, you wrote this paper on this. I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of the motivation for why you looked at protocols and something about what you came to in that paper.
Yeah. So together with my co-author, Sam Lai, we really were interested in this question of how trust and safety and content moderation work in the context of decentralized or federated platforms where there isn't the kind of central locus of control that exists at a service like Twitter. And what struck us was that there was enormous ambition, especially following Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, around this idea of returning control to people themselves, of creating a social web that looked a lot more like it did, 15, 20 years ago, where people could control their own data, have more direct control over their experience, be less locked into these walled garden ecosystems. And at the root of that was this idea of, well, communities should be able to set their own rules and govern themselves. And there's huge appeal in that, right? It sort of gets at every bit of, democratic thinking.
Yeah, it's like a crazy idea. Maybe we should have democracy.
No, exactly. And I was really excited about it as well. I was coming off of 8 years of having the weight of making some of these decisions for hundreds of millions of people at Twitter. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice? And then I saw my first piece of spam on Mastodon. And this sounds really trivial because it's like, okay, Yoel, don't be dramatic. It's one piece of spam. But it raised a question for me of like, okay, well, who's going to deal with this?
Yep.
Because I just used to spend all day, every day, removing billions of pieces of spam on Twitter. And I can tell you it was hard. And more than that, it was expensive. And so Sam and I started looking at this dynamic of what tools are available to the people who appoint themselves the custodians of federated and decentralized platforms. We weren't asking what the rules are. That's the democratic part. Communities can decide their own policies. It's more like once you've picked your policies, okay, how do you put that into practice?
Yep.
And what we found was a little bit dismaying. First, we found that on the whole, the tools that were available to moderators or to admins of federated platforms looked a whole lot less sophisticated than some of the tools that we had at Twitter or that other larger services had. Some of them boiled down to something as simple as like Mastodon for a long time lacked the ability to ban multiple users at once. There were moments where my team at Twitter would ban 1 million users at once. Having to ban spam account by account just foundationally doesn't work. And so the more that we scratch the surface, looking at Mastodon, looking at other services based on ActivityPub, looking at Blue Sky in its earliest days, and then looking at Threads as Meta started to develop it, what we saw was that a lot of the services that were leaning the hardest into community-based control gave their communities the least technical tools to be able to administer their policies. So that was sort of the first insight there. The second thing that we observed was that there was a pretty big backslide on some of the transparency and decision legitimacy that we had built so painfully up at Twitter. We've been talking about how companies explain decisions like banning a sitting president. What we saw was that on many of these platforms, people didn't even receive a notice if they got banned. Posts would just vanish. There wouldn't be, at Twitter we called it a tombstone. There wouldn't be a tombstone left behind even indicating to somebody that a post used to exist. And I don't blame startups for being startups or new pieces of software for lacking all the bells and whistles, but if the whole point of the project was increasing democratic legitimacy of governance, and what we've done is take a step back on governance, then has this actually worked at all?
Yeah, there's no easy way within the Fediverse to even understand which instances block which other instances. And so there's some lists and there's some tools, and IFTOS is now around, which is doing great work. But when you and Sam wrote the paper, that stuff didn't exist. And you're like, we believe in democracy, but we haven't given you the tools for it.
Totally. One of the most consistent things that came out of the interviews that we were doing with developers and moderators and admins was money. And you brought up IFTOS. IFTOS stands for Independent Federated Trust and Safety. And it's an organization that's dedicated to building out the trust and safety function for the Fediverse and for all of the folks that are operating or managing or moderating instances of federated social services.
I know that they go beyond just the ActivityPub world. I use IFTOS stuff in some of my Nostr registration too. They're interested in the larger social web ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right. And they build out tooling to help support a bunch of different parts of what trust and safety looks like in the context of federated platforms. One of their biggest areas of focus has been enabling detection for CSAM, or child sexual abuse media. Their work in that space involves making available detections and classifiers so that if you're running a Mastodon instance, you can have software that automatically detects if somebody uploads a piece of child sexual abuse material to your platform. IFTOS was doing remarkable work to try to build tooling to empower moderators, to build some tools to do things like CSAM detection for the Fediverse, and they ran out of money and largely had to sunset many of their projects in early 2025. And we saw it coming. We saw it coming 2 years ago. IFTOS saw it coming. Everybody who's been working in this space is largely volunteering their time and efforts, and that only goes so far. Because at some point, people have families and need to pay bills, and compute costs stack up if you need to run ML models to detect certain types of bad content. It just all gets expensive, and the economics of this federated approach to trust and safety never quite added up, and in my opinion, still don't.
Well, they don't, and we need to figure that out. We need to figure out the way in which we are able to fund this, not just the technology, but the social labor of this self-governance. Otherwise, people will fall back and they'll just rely on Meta, which sells you to ads.
That was ultimately the conclusion that we reached through our study. We looked at the tools and the policies that Meta had in place for Instagram that they were porting over to Threads, and it became really clear that for all of anybody's concerns or skepticism about Meta's approach to governance, and I will raise my hand and say I don't use their products if I can avoid them, it seemed like the safest corner of the Fediverse, even in terms of things as foundational as dealing with spam or child sexual abuse was going to be Meta's corner of it. And that felt like a real failure condition for the whole project.
One of the things about CSAM that I find so interesting is everybody has the obligation to detect it and report it, but only the large companies have the tools to do it.
That's right. And unfortunately, the tools for CSAM detection in particular are a real walled garden. The industry standard for detection is a tool called PhotoDNA that was developed by Microsoft and ultimately has a database of hashed images of known child sexual abuse material. And one of the industry standard ways of detecting CSAM is checking uploaded pieces of content against the PhotoDNA database. But getting access to PhotoDNA, running it, having the compute associated with that, those are all complex and expensive and not open to everyone. And democratizing access to some of those tools is one of the real focus areas for IFTAS and other folks building trust and safety capabilities for the Fediverse.
We need more independent institutions like that we can rely on.
But we can't assume that they can fund themselves.
No, they have to have it. We need
Yeah.
a funding model. We need an economic model by which communities can fund these things and support them. And if they don't, then they'll go away.
That's right. I think we all can kind of immediately recognize the needs, but when it comes time for somebody to raise their hand and put money behind it or come up with a funding model that's going to work in perpetuity, it hasn't really played out that way so far.
One thing that really jumped out from your and Sam's paper was, as a user, you think about trust and safety and accounts being banned based on the content of it. I said this offensive thing. I did this, death threat. I, posted harassment and stuff like that. But what you describe the work you're doing and the need was a whole set of kind of problems that needed to be addressed, coordinated inauthentic activity and things like that.
Yeah. For me, a lot of this was informed by the experience of helping Twitter figure out what happened in the 2016 election. So it's January 2017. The US intelligence community puts out this bombshell report saying Russia interfered in American elections. And Twitter's exec team, Jack included, came to me and were like, you've been doing stuff around bots. Like,
did they?
What happened? And so we sort of close ourselves in a room for about a year and start uncovering what happened. And the most striking thing to me from a lot of that work was how a lot of the Russian accounts that we identified on Twitter weren't posting lies.
Yes.
This was around the same time that the phrase fake news started making the rounds.
Because we thought it was all lies. We thought it was like intentionally like all fake information. And
no, and that wasn't the case at all, right? The earliest prototype attempts at Russian manipulation on Twitter, this is back in like 2015, were hoaxes. So they were trying to convince people that some turkey on Thanksgiving was poisoned, or there was an outbreak of Ebola in Atlanta. It was just goofy shit. And it went absolutely nowhere. These hoaxes got zero attention. They got no traction on the platform. But then what worked? What worked were posts that were emotionally charged, but not factual. It was things like celebrating Black beauty, or talking about inclusivity, or in some cases talking about gun rights and the need to combat abortion. And these types of opinion-driven, emotionally charged pieces of content on both the left and the right got an enormous amount of attention in a way that the straight-up lies never did. And so what do you do with that? Yeah. You don't combat it as fake news. Right? Yeah. You don't go at it as like, is this true or false? You say, are the behaviors that are being used to amplify this content inauthentic? And there are lots of good ways to do that. In 2017, we started with a really obvious one, which is this account registered with a Russian phone number, and does it claim to be in the United States? And we found a bunch of accounts that did. My favorite one of the bunch was an account named Crystal Johnson, who claimed to be a Black woman living in New York City. She tended to post kind of feel-good content about racial justice and equality. Jack retweeted her 18 times. And I say this not to go after Jack, but just to say the CEO,
Like it resonated.
the CEO of the company liked this content, amplified it, and had no way of knowing as a user that Crystal Johnson was actually a Russian troll. I did when I looked at the way that the account was registered.
But you looked at it in a way that a centralized platform has data and information that we maybe don't have in protocols.
That's right. And some of this boils down to basic questions around privacy and how much should you be collecting, right? Twitter was, for all that it was a public platform, also tried to be a good steward of user data. We tried to practice data minimization. We tried not to store a whole bunch of information that we didn't need, but we did store things like the IP address that you registered from. And when you'd access the service, we would log how you were accessing it, things like device identifiers. And so when we needed to do forensic analysis of, let's say, a Russian troll farm, we had the data to do it. That's not the case on a lot of federated platforms. They either don't collect it at all, or they collect it, but the logs are inaccessible, or in some cases, we had admins say, yeah, I have information, but it would be a violation of trust for me to look at it. And that's a reasonable perspective, but there are consequences. And some of them are, it's a lot harder to do the work of identifying fake accounts.
And if we don't identify fake accounts, if we don't identify this stuff, then people lose trust in the ecosystem. I mean, I guess that what you deal with at Match now is very much based on how much do you trust the people you're talking to are real.
Totally. I mean, it's the number one piece of trust and safety feedback that we hear in the online dating context. It's, am I matching with somebody who is real and authentic? But there's another layer to it. One of the things we saw at Twitter that was the most interesting to me was this phenomenon of people accusing each other of being bots. And I find this really troubling from a democratic perspective, because I think it's how public discourse dies. But essentially, from 2018 onwards, when everybody started to become aware of bots and trolls and election interference, we started seeing a lot of people on Twitter who would accuse each other in a disagreement of being a bot. So person A posts something political, person B disagrees with them and replies. Person A then says, yeah, whatever, like fuck off, bot. And for a long time, I actually would review these posts manually. I set up an alert that would send me a bunch
You're like,
of
are they any of these actual bots?
And my hit rate was 0 bots. In months of doing this, I looked at hundreds of instances of people accusing each other of being bots, and nobody was ever right. Researchers at the University of Indiana have validated this even further. They've done studies that look at how do political affiliations impact the reliability of people's ability to identify bots. Turns out Democrats are really bad at identifying whether other Democrats are bots, and they think they're not, but they think Republicans are bots, and vice versa. So
it's like, all whatever bias. Like if I agree with it, then obviously this is a real person. If I disagree with it, then
it must be fake.
Yeah.
And foundationally, that strikes me as a way to not engage with the substance of what somebody is saying and just dismiss them out of hand. And in the dating context, there's consequences for that too. We see sometimes that if men believe that the women they're matching with are fake accounts, they'll actually behave more abusively, not just towards the fake accounts, but towards real accounts as well, because they're like, look, it's all bots and who cares? And so all of this to me points to a foundational need to treat authenticity as one of the most significant trust and safety efforts we can do, but doing it is hard.
And what happens now with large language models that can produce things that feel very coherent in the conversations of what people are doing and what they look like and what the videos are and everything else. I know you aren't working on social media at the moment, but have you thought about how you even tackle the issue of trust and safety on social media now that we have unleashed just infinitely more powerful bots?
I mean, to me, it has to come down to looking at behavior the way that we have been since 2017. I think the content of posts, the messages, might get more persuasive. And there's been incredible research out from folks previously at the Stanford Internet Observatory that was studying this question of like LLMs being persuasive in a political context. And they found that in a bunch of instances, LLMs could actually be more convincing when properly tuned than humans. And so that's bad. But a lot of the behavioral signatures around things like creating multiple accounts or using automation to post or posting at sort of weird times of the day that correspond with different time zones, these are behavioral signals that are latent even in really convincing content.
Interesting.
And I think that's where you have to start this. If you're starting with the content, you're in an arms race against leading AI models and you've already lost.
That's really fascinating that it's all that other metadata. It's all the human behavior and history of it. One of the arguments that I had with Jack over the years was he was like, it's one Twitter. We're bringing the entire world together. And and you hear Mark Zuckerberg talk about this, like we're connecting the world. And I sat down in New Zealand with some Maori and they're like, we don't have a bunch of the abusive behavior in Maori Twitter because you have to speak Te Reo Maori to participate in this community on Twitter. So the barrier before you can switch from English to Te Reo, you go for a very small community where people have this social connections. Effectively, it gives you a group within Twitter.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any thoughts about having tried to moderate the one big space and whether or not there are limits to that. And like we see these group chats all the time and things like that. Are we going to see the less viable big social?
I think there's an argument to be made that there is such a thing as too big when it comes to speech platforms. I mean, foundationally, we humans are not homogenous. There's billions of people on this planet who themselves have different preferences. They're part of groups, whether they are identity-based groups or family units or whatever, that lead them to have different preferences. And at the end of the day, if you're trying to make decisions about speech for a community of 2 billion people, which is what Instagram has to do every single day, that is a harder governance problem than any government in the history of humanity has had to solve. Like
there is no 2 billion person government. Like
no, it doesn't exist. And my belief is looking around at the tools that we have today, I don't know that it can. And so there's consequences for that, right? I think when you start looking at whether maybe smaller communities are a better fit and are better governed, this is something that Darius Kazemi, the creator of Hometown, has talked a lot about. I think there's a ton of merit to that, right? Give people groups where there can be more of that trust, more of that understanding, more of that self-governance. I think there's incredible opportunity within that. But even within small groups, I think deception and bad behavior are a factor.
It doesn't obviate the need for governance.
No, that's right. One of the most significant communities on Twitter has always been Black Twitter. And in sort of the early days of Russian interference on Twitter, there was a hashtag, "Your slip is showing," that was folks within Black Twitter talking about accounts that they believed were faking being a part of Black Twitter. And it was one, remarkably accurate stuff. And then two, it was amazing in how it was a community defending itself, even without a lot of the tools and information that platforms would have. And that was a success story that also points to the bigger risk here, which is no matter how big or small your community is, you should assume that there's going to be bad actors that target you. And whether it's time, energy, resources, tools, technology, there's going to be dependencies that you have to fulfill to protect that community. And so I don't know that the small web dynamic necessarily solves that problem. It maybe buys you a little bit more time and a little bit more protection, but the threats will come. And being complacent because you're part of a small community doesn't make the problems go away long term.
Absolutely. One of the things that's inspired me over the last year is the work that Rudy has done building Black Sky, where he is saying basically he didn't want to have his community exist on a platform that could get sold. And he wanted to build on these open protocols, but he didn't want to be dependent on what the Blue Sky team decided for them. So they built their first algorithm and their moderation team, and they have a paid moderation team, and they're going and building the entire app protocol stack from scratch so that they can own their own platform.
I think Black Sky is absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
I think the commitment to building independent infrastructure that is interoperable and is also foundationally useful, like fundamentally building a product that people want and find valuable is the best thing that could happen for the internet right now. The question I always come back to is, where in the stack does somebody else have control?
Yeah.
And then what are the levers in place to protect that part of your stack from being subverted? I think Blue Sky makes kind of a bunch of really impressive architectural decisions about how they've built their platform and how they approach governance. I think they've opened a lot of tools to the community. They've enabled things like community labelers to kind of make moderation a bit more open. But then one of the ways that app protocol is set up does create this central point around identity. Identity still is managed centrally, and the decision there was, if we want to have sort of big social web discovery, we need to have some kind of monolithic store for user identity. I think that's a reasonable trade-off, and I have liked the way that discovery and interaction work on Blue Sky since I first signed up.
It works a lot better than on Nostr, which is what I work on, and you know, you have multiple names and you can have username lookup and things like that, but essentially you're using public keys.
No, totally. But like now you have a control point. And what happens when there's a wave of community outrage to not just apply a moderation label to somebody, not just remove them from your PDS, but to actually make it so that they can't exist in the app protocol ecosystem at all? I think the team have signaled that they're not going to do that, but what happens?
Well, that's the question. And you know, the thing that gives me some faith that Blue Sky won't is because Rudy and the Black Sky team, and their R Sky is the name of the software they're building, is a viable alternative. And you can easily leave. If there wasn't a viable alternative, then it would be harder to hold the Blue Sky team to account.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the ability to have a right of exit that includes porting not just your content and not even just like downloading your content in this kind of useless JSON archive.
Absolutely. It's not your data. It's your connections to other people.
No, totally. You can take them with you and they remain interactive. It remains your content the way that you created it. That's priceless. That fundamentally changes the way that all of this works.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. And for me, one of the reasons I was looking at new protocols instead of just building on ActivityPub is because ActivityPub makes that quite difficult.
Yep. I think the debate about which protocol is better or worse or has different trade-offs built into it is going to rage on forever. We will never be settled with this. But ultimately, I think from a consumer perspective, what matters now is building great products that feel like a meaningful step forward in user empowerment. And I think at the moment we're seeing a couple of different futures for the social web. One of them is pretty much what Meta has been doing with their products, which is offering a reasonably well-moderated experience most of the time and a familiar product with a gigantic social graph that they port from app to app. And then there's new entrants. And we're seeing that the different protocols have trade-offs associated with them. The moderation approaches are sometimes better, sometimes worse. Sometimes companies are going to make mistakes. But I think from a consumer standpoint, it's a moment where you actually can say, I can pick from amongst these different options and find things that are going to be useful to me.
One of the fascinating things for me, the early Blue Sky days, is the moment when the Blue Sky team was like, we don't want any moderation. And the community of early adopters, when they only had a couple million people, were like, no, you need to set up a moderation system and you need to do these things. And I was afraid that they would then do the moderation thing and not open up and not create the interoperability, the right to exit.
No, that's right. The balance that Blue Sky in particular has struck here, I think, is a useful and instructive one. There's a feeling of responsibility. That same, going back to earlier in our conversation, like the raising your hand and being like, yeah, this is my problem now. I think they've recognized that they have an obligation to do that, but that obligation is primarily localized within their app. So within the thing with the butterfly icon on the home screen of your phone, that's their ethical responsibility. And they're funding trust and safety. They employ a team of moderators. They're doing this work at scale. There's obviously room for improvement. I'd love to see them be a bit more transparent. But fundamentally, they're doing the right stuff. But there's also a recognition that outside of the four walls of the Blue Sky app, there can be an ecosystem built on that technology that works by different rules, and they're going to cede governance of that space to other folks. And that feels like the right balance to strike.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and my hope is that it gives us the platforms to do that self-governance and that right to exit. The reason I put together this sort of social media bill of rights wasn't because I think these new emerging platforms aren't doing it the right way. It's because I wanted to give people some sort of anchor to be like, we need self-governance. We need a say about our algorithms. We need the right to exit. You need to own your username.
Yeah, foundationally, I think this idea of greater autonomy, control, and ownership is foundational to how the social web is going to work. I think one of the challenges that we face, and this kind of goes back to the Fediverse paper that Sam and I wrote, is there are some things where individual rights and community rights are going to come in tension with each other. And the question is, who's going to defend community rights where those might be in conflict with the preferences or the actions of a specific individual? An example that I think is really challenging is something like doxing. Imagine that somebody posts my home address on a social media site. I never see it. I've used all of the community moderation tools available to me. I've filtered it out. There's an algorithm. I never encounter that piece of content. That piece of content is still dangerous to me because it's my address out there.
In fact, it potentially is more dangerous that you didn't see it and you don't know that people are going around doxing you.
Totally. And so in that moment, the question is, where in my Bill of Rights does that right to protection come into play? And then who is responsible for conferring that right onto me? And I think right now, a service like Blue Sky have said, within the walls of our app, that's our responsibility. I think the more distributed this gets, you start to run into these questions of whose job is it to actually enforce and enact those protections for things that aren't just about your exposure to a given piece of content.
Yeah. One of the other things that I found so fascinating as these systems grew up is the initial founders of almost all of these companies are straight white men. And straight white men's experience on social media is distinctly different than almost everybody else. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that conflict that you've experienced. You're a gay man who has been very out in your world online, but also worked with a very diverse set of people in trust and safety.
Foundationally, when you're making trust and safety decisions, I think you have to incorporate a wide range of perspectives because you have to recognize the limits of your own positionality. And if you don't start from that premise, you're kind of inevitably doomed to failure. I have the lived experience of being a gay man on the internet. I have the lived experience of being an American white guy. I have the experience of growing up in Florida and now living in California. And all of these things shape who I am. They shape my sense of morality, my sense of ethics, and ultimately the decisions I make. I'm also a researcher. And so I've tried to stay abreast of the best social science and humanities work looking at internet governance, and I try to build that into my decision making too. But every part of that ultimately is a limited slice of the world that reflects the experiences that I've managed to have in my time on this planet. And that's going to be different from yours and different from everyone else's. And the minute that you kind of lose that perspective, you are doomed to making decisions that just reinforce the inherent biases and power structures that you're a part of. At its best moments, Twitter tried to address this.
Yep.
We tried to do it by leading with research. We held public comment periods when we were building out new policies. We tried to survey folks about what they were looking for us to do and implement. It wasn't democracy, but it was a step in that direction of incorporating additional perspectives. We tried to build diverse teams that would bring those different perspectives in. It wasn't perfect. I mean, ask anybody who's been part of a group that has been harassed or harmed on Twitter, whether they think that their perspectives were sufficiently represented within the company. And the answer obviously is no. But I do think striving for that inclusivity has to be part of what governance on the internet is, with the recognition that taking that to its extreme, you're back at how do you govern a 2 billion person space in an inclusive way? And I think at a certain point, the perspectives are just too heterogeneous for that to work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the most surreal aspect of watching projects I worked on, with the podcasting thing and then Twitter and other projects, go from these are an idea that a few people hanging out in South Park in San Francisco are talking about, to something that the entire world or a huge portion of the world is using, is seeing my values embedded in the technology that everyone else has. And initially be like, that's great, because I think I have great values. My parents went to UC Berkeley and they were hippies. And, I grew up incorporated in that Northern California counterculture. And so to see that rolled out to the world, you're like, this is amazing. And at the same time, then you see all of the contradictions of that particular kind of intersection of capital and counterculture. Yeah. And it's not the values that the world should have.
No, that's right. One of the questions I used to ask folks when I would interview them for a job at Twitter was sort of a slightly generic variant of a world leader posts something that is sort of immediately and directly harmful or dangerous. How do you make decisions about removing that person or not, or sort of making a moderation choice there? And what I would try to suss out of that question is not what their politics are. I fundamentally didn't care. It was, what is your thought process? And ultimately, are you thinking about the different constituencies that are going to have divergent opinions on that topic? In the most successful job interview that I did with somebody for a role on my team, the conversation ended up leading us to, is it Twitter's job to promote democracy? And I still kind of wrestle with that one. Not from a what is my personal opinion standpoint.
We certainly thought it was the case at the beginning.
I generally think democracy is a really good thing, and I'd like to see more of it. And I would like to see illiberal governments around the world generally trend towards liberalism. But there are competing value sets that people have. And in some instances, democracy is a subordinate value to things like community cohesion. And this isn't sort of me promoting or endorsing unbridled cultural relativism, but it is a recognition that when you're talking about hundreds of millions of people in different countries using the same platform, it is a presumption to say that a value like democracy ought to have primacy. I personally think it should, but that's not an obvious conclusion.
Well, and it's not like we run our Silicon Valley companies as democracies either.
No, that's right. I mean, they're largely businesses that exist within a framework of capitalism. And all of that, I think, leads to these inherent contradictions. And I don't know that anybody's really resolved it. I don't know that in a big web model of every human on the planet in a single network, I don't know that we ever can.
Yeah, I don't think there is one size fits all. I don't think there is one answer. And one of the exciting parts for me about the social media protocols is we can build mini solutions that aren't walled off, and that if the leaders or the controllers of the place you are don't behave the way you like, you have the right to exit. And having the right to exit gives you more voice in these platforms. I guess I would sort of like to wrap up with a couple questions.
Fire away.
One, for people using and building these new platforms, for people deciding on it, what should they be looking at? What should they be caring about?
Care about spam from day one. And I say that not only because spam's, bad and I find it just kind of offensive as a thing, but I think solving spam helps you solve a whole lot of other governance challenges in a scalable way. It requires you to think about governance and speech not as one person or one utterance, but as a networked phenomenon. In the earliest days of Blue Sky, I remember having a conversation with Dana Boyd, actually, where we were kind of rapping on how interesting the invite system was and the way that trust and safety could operate in a completely different way because of this model of an invite graph that connected every person to the person who invited them onto the platform. And it sort of blew my mind in the early days to think about this as a source of signal in the context of anti-spam. And of course, for reasonable reasons, Blue Sky moved away from that.
But they did actually find several trees of bad actors from those invite trees.
And that notion of thinking about trust and safety, not as post by post, word by word, but network by network, I think has to be a foundational part of how you build and how you think about social technologies.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think that that's part of understanding the difference between it's not just me, it's not just my content, but I exist within a community, I exist within this space. And the problem with the idea of it's just your privacy or your data, well, you download your data, but you've lost all the conversations, the connections, everything else. We are social creatures.
Yeah. No, that's right. We exist within an embedded ecosystem of interactions. We interact with others, others interact with us. And along the way, there's a lot of information out there. You can use it for good, you can use it for evil. But if you're thinking about it as a builder and as a developer, you should be thinking about how you can harness the information that you have to protect folks. And that's not about viewpoints, it's not about opinions, it's usually not even about content. It's just foundationally about how those interactions can reveal to you the bad actors that I guarantee are already in your ecosystem.
That's super insightful. Thank you. One last question. Who else do you think I should be talking to about these conversations?
Talk to the historians. There's a joke that goes around sometimes that every idea on the social internet was already attempted once before, usually on LiveJournal. And so talk to the folks who have been building social platforms and moderating social platforms for decades. And some of it is like, there's stories to be told and nostalgia to be had, and it's awesome. But also, we're always rediscovering old ideas. And I remember a moment when at Twitter, we introduced, I forget what it was called. It was sort of voice notes in tweets. And you could sort of record yourself and then post, and then that would sort of show up. And I was like, I used to do this on LiveJournal. You could call a phone number and record something, and then it would automatically post a voice recording to your LiveJournal, and Twitter reinvented it 15 years later.
Well, did you know that one of the other hackathon projects that happened when we created Twitter was this thing called Hellodio that let you do flash recording of little audios and you get a feed of them and stuff like that?
We keep coming up. We return fondly to old ideas. And so talk to the historians, talk to folks like Denise Paolucci, who have been doing trust and safety since the beginning of time, talk to folks like Alice Marwick, who've been writing the histories of social platforms. These are, I think, the folks who are going to have the keys to not repeating the mistakes of the past.
That's a fascinating thing. It reminds me of something Tony Stubblebine, who's now CEO of Medium, said when we sat down to do the brainstorming at Twitter. And Tony was going on about this university system that let you do plan updates and like keep people's status and everything else. And it was this super funky system. But it was one of the examples of what became Twitter, because what we were saying is like, well, everything that existed in the past existed as the same human interactions and things, but with the different technology constraints. What happens with the technology constraint becomes the smartphone. And now every time I think about some new emerging technology, like now that we can do decentralized social protocols in a way that works, or large language models or whatever it is, I'm like, how do I remember that lesson of history? History is long and humans haven't changed that much.
At the core of it, I think that's the lesson. We're trying to find solutions to the same foundational needs, and the packaging changes, the bandwidth changes. There was when I was writing my PhD, I read this piece by somebody who had worked for a minute as a phone sex operator, and the way that they were talking about this experience of being a sex worker providing phone sex was of taking this complex phenomenon, this embodied experience of having sex, and compressing it into the low bandwidth format of an analog phone line. And I thought that phrasing was magical because it really tells us the human needs are the same. The technology, the bandwidth, the tools that we have available are what changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the biggest lesson of especially when we look at the evolution of social technology.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun to have you have this conversation, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you for doing it. This is gonna be great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks again to Yoel Roth for coming on revolution.social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
This episode was edited and produced by Eric Johnson from lightningpod.fm. Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan from Flock Marketing.
To learn more about the Social Media Bill of Rights and sign up for our email newsletter, visit revolution.social.
For more interviews like this one, follow revolution.social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, nostasfountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatistas subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back next week. See you then.